What could be more different than ecology and transit? The one is organic, the other mechanical. Yet cities and natural environments are both complex systems of exchange and interaction. If we want systems like transit to work well in cities, it may help us to understand a few things about natural ecology. In today's episode, we'll be using natural ecology to understand the surprising results from last week's homework, pedestrian and bicycle safety, multifunctional bikeways, why motorized vehicles will be very different in car-free cities, and how those vehicles will handle freight, delivery, maintenance, and emergencies. Welcome to Edenicity, best practices for sustainably abundant cities. We evolved in complex ecologies, so we're really good at pattern recognition. Our brains evolved to keep us alive by having a strong negative response to things that don't fit the patterns that we're used to. This is a universal problem for urban planning and design. We're used to thinking of things the way they are, so we often panic when confronted by things as they could be. Worse, our minds haven't fully bridged the gap between intuitive complexity and step-by-step reasoning. Science isolates variables in a system so that we can identify and apply first principles. These are things like energy, force, momentum, and charge. Our brains tend to glitch on this and reduce the things in our lives to a singular function. You walk on a sidewalk. You drive on the street. You live in one place and shop or work in another place. You grow one crop on one parcel of land and another crop on another parcel of land. A roof protects you from the weather, and it has nothing at all to do with walking or transit or gardening or powering your home, until now. Fortunately, much of our evolution happened in natural ecologies, so we can be very holistic and adaptable in our thinking. Even very complex designs can just click in our minds. Putting a phone and the whole internet in your pocket didn't make sense at all until, all of a sudden, it kinda did. And in fact, most of us saw this coming. We realized the potential of smartphones long before smartphones became smart. In today's episode, we're going to be using 3 themes from ecology. First, tight resource loops. Another word for this is ergonomics. Most beings live close to their food sources, unless of course they're avoiding disease or predation. The urban analogy to this is mixed-use development, which is of course still separated from heavy industry and large, raucous entertainment. Our second theme is interactive diversity, which in aerospace, we used to call block redundancy. In a healthy ecosystem, a range of species will supply every critical need. Forests, for example, thrive for millennia without any fertilizer because many species of trees provide leaf mulch and fixed nitrogen, and many bird species supply the soil with phosphate. And third, stacking functions, which directly challenges the glitch in our mind about single use. In a healthy ecosystem, nothing does only one thing. Mulberry trees, for example, grow all over the world, and each tree can provide fruit, leaves for tea, leaves for silkworms, mulch, shade, windbreak, soil retention, groundwater recharge, habitat for many animals, and for people, beautiful wood for turning. A mulberry tree stacks functions. It doesn't do just one thing. With these principles in mind, let's turn to our homework or poll results from last week. Last time I showed that even high-speed metros would be a little bit slower than walking to a town center. So I posed the question, would people prefer to get to neighboring villages and to the town center by bike, or would they prefer to be on Team Metro? Well, here are the results. And as you can see, the winner is trams, which wasn't actually on the list, and mixed modes and bike sharing and all kinds of other things. This is a perfect example of interactive diversity. We really prefer a range of options. Let me go through these in detail. Just about everybody mentioned trams. People just love trams. Modern trams have an incredible view and are very convenient, and they get you from point A to point B when it's not so easy to climb on a bike or wrangle some sort of personal mobility device. They're also still very much lower cost than cars and roads, and they're almost certainly lower cost than underground metros. Now, I got to wondering about land use, but of course, trams can carry so many more people than a single lane of traffic that, again, that's not much of a problem. The extra space that a village would devote to trams really doesn't add up to much at all. They're a little bit slower than bikes, but much faster than walking. And convenience is the key. In a village, rather than having one metro stop, you could easily have 3 tram stops, so that the walking distance to the tram from any point in the village is much shorter than it would be to the metro. If the trams are not separated from foot traffic, They will need to be speed limited to 20 kilometers an hour or so. And when I plugged that into my calculations, including the 3 stops per village, the trip times from your village to the town center at most went from 18 minutes to 32 minutes, which I think is very livable. And I think people understand that trams are not meant to be super fast. People understand that and use trams anyway, especially in hilly terrain. I love the fact that people voted for options that I didn't give them. The mixed modes, which a number of people mentioned, are a perfect example of our biological preference for interactive diversity. Mixed modes would include pedestrians, bikes, trams, scooters, waterways, whatever means are available. And really, because all of these choices consume so much less space and so much less money than roads and cars, I think it's basically up to the cities to choose what combination of these to deploy. Strangely enough, nobody mentioned buses, which are also, I think, a potentially good alternative. So well done. I think we all passed the homework with flying colors. Let's move on to another point of ecology, stacking functions. In the reference design for Edenicity, which you can find in the link in the comments, you'll see that there's solar sheltered bikeways. Now, I know these somewhat triggered a few people. They're really different from the patterns that we're used to, but I also think that in practice, people would find them really useful and really not want to go back once they're built. So let's break these down a little bit. First of all, I've been calling these bikeways, but really these are multi-use paths, as you'll see in a moment. The shelters, when I price them out, come out to about twice what you'd pay for the pavement. They allow all-weather access and slightly reduce the maintenance demands. I mean, for one thing, you're not plowing snow off of the road to nearly the extent that you would if it were not sheltered. You can put solar panels on those roofs for about 4 times the cost of the pavement, and that will provide about 9% of the energy for the village, just for those 2 paths that cross the village center. The shelters can stack additional functions as well. They can capture rainwater, and if we attach them to gutters, these can feed creeks, ponds, and cisterns, depending on climate. We can line them with recessed lighting that would provide really useful nighttime illumination that would also minimize the light pollution that's so harmful to migrating wildlife. When you add it up, we can do all of these things and still have the total sheltered bike path come out to some 40 times less than highways with the same lane capacity, and many times less than roads. Our original design had just 2 multi-use paths going through the village center, but we could also shelter many or all of the paths in a village and still provide up to 54% of the energy that the village needs and still cost 7 times less than a highway or road with the same lane capacity. Now, speaking of lane capacity, how wide should these multi-use paths be? Here's some of that first principle thinking that I mentioned before. The stop distance is based on speed, deceleration, and reaction time. And for bikes, the stop distance works out to something like 8 meters, or 4 bike lengths. From your stop distance, you can calculate the lane capacity, which works out to just shy of 2,000 riders per hour. Now, what's the lane width? The bike itself is pretty narrow. It's about half a meter, but really you need about a meter width per bike minimum for it to be useful at all. And we still need to know how much traffic to expect. Now, crunching the numbers, if we want to be able to evacuate the whole village in well under an hour, the bike path width needs to be 4 meters. But as you'll see in a moment, we would be wise to build it higher and wider. Higher than we need for bikes, because then we can accommodate large deliveries. The maximum vehicle height on a US highway is 13.5 feet, which works out to 4 meters. The extra sheltered width will allow more traffic modes and do a better job keeping the weather out. Now, if we're doing so much to encourage bicycling, some viewers very naturally worried about pedestrian and bicycle safety. Fortunately, there's some very simple traffic calming measures that we can take for bicycles. The main one being village size. The bigger the village, the more tempting it's going to be to try to get around within the village on a bicycle. The village size that you'll see in the reference design for Edenicity is such that you can walk across the village from one corner to the other in 10 or 11 minutes. If the villages were twice that size, you could fit 4 times as many people, but now a lot of people would take their bikes to go anywhere in the village, and now we have a lot more high-speed traffic to contend with within the village. So size is our first line of defense against excessive bicycling within the village. Now, in areas where there's pedestrians, what we can also do is work with the texture of the pavement to slow bicyclists down. And this can be very simple, just putting in pavers to add a little bit of a bump or rumble to remind bicyclists that pedestrians have priority. Finally, near the village centers, we can install roundabouts, at least on the major bike paths. Let's talk a little bit about those other modes of transit that we'll be sharing these multi multi-use pathways. Trams, buses are all options that cities should explore. All of these can carry at least 10 times more people than car lanes, so they don't increase the land use by that much. They cost far less, but safety can be a huge problem. They must either be grade separated from pedestrians or have mechanical speed limit controllers, otherwise known as governors, to keep their speed down to a safe level. Now, I think it's clear by now that Edenicity is so sustainable that we are talking about electric vehicles for everything. And I realize that there's been a little bit of pushback on that. So let's get into this in a little bit of detail. One key point is that most electric vehicles, with the exception of small carts, kick scooters, wheelchairs, and the like, are going to be owned by the village, city, or town, and not by private individuals. Deep breath here. I know this is what we were talking about early on, about a different pattern causing a visceral reaction. You can feel it, right? What? No private car ownership? That panicky feeling. But take a step back. Consider that we can either be free on the streets to come and go as we please and interact as we please, or we can own private vehicles. We can't have both. The two are completely incompatible, as the past century of increasing car dependence in cities has shown. The YouTuber Adam Something has done a brilliant video, which I'll link in the comments, about how the car industry stole our streets, which was a public realm that people have enjoyed for thousands of years. For the very few motorized vehicles that are not public transit, the majority of them will be publicly owned and publicly housed. For parking, there will be just basically one space for each of them in a garage, probably near the village and town centers. There will be multi-use loading areas near each of the residential buildings within a village. And I would recommend that speeds be governed to 10 kilometers an hour. Okay, deep breath. I know, this is a really big change. 20 kilometers an hour for emergency vehicles. In miles an hour, we're talking about 6 miles and 12 miles an hour, twice and 4 times normal walking speed. If this worries you, this is the panic that I was talking about earlier. But let's go through the reasoning in detail. These are electric vehicles. Their batteries would weigh 10 to 20 times less than the batteries on most electric vehicles in use today. Why is that? Well, the compact footprint of Edenicity means that the distance these vehicles are going between charges is 5 to 10 times shorter. The charging stations are closer. Charging times are shorter because the batteries are smaller, so the charging can happen more frequently without inconvenience. That by itself can reduce the battery size by another factor of 2. Speeds are 10 times slower, so there's less air drag, less rolling resistance, so even less energy use, and again, that reduces the total energy storage required for the battery. Collisions are 10 times slower. That means the energy involved in a collision is 100 times lower, so vehicles will not need giant airbags or huge, heavy crumple zones. Let me make this last point crystal clear. Let's go into the collision physics in a little bit of detail. Here's the equation, and here's the result. For a delivery vehicle, or that rare beast in Edenicity, a taxi, going at 10 kilometers an hour, if it collides with a brick wall, it would feel an impact equivalent to a 0.4 meter fall, or falling from 1.3 feet. Most of us can take a 1.3 foot fall all day long. An emergency vehicle in a front-end collision would experience the equivalent of a 1.6 meter fall. That's about a 5-foot fall. That's like jumping a fence. Again, many of us can do that all day long. It would be mildly traumatic, but not life-threatening in the vast majority of cases. A metro, on the other hand, goes 100 kilometers an hour, and if that crashes, it's suffering the equivalent of a 39 meter or 128 foot fall, which would be absolutely lethal without all of the added safety equipment. A car or a metro is deadly in a collision and requires separation from pedestrians. Now, with these slow speeds, you might be wondering, now wait a minute, aren't the trip times going to be outrageous? Well, let's look at what those trip times work out to be. A delivery vehicle or taxi going 10 kilometers an hour would take 1 to 4 minutes to get anywhere within the village, and 4 to 17 minutes to get to an adjacent village or the town center. That seems quite reasonable. An emergency vehicle will take 0 to 1 minute to get to any destination within the village, and between 2 and 9 minutes to get to the town center. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I think you can see that because of the very compact footprint of Edenicity, they're as good or better than what we enjoy in today's cities with all of that massive car and road infrastructure. Let's get into specific use cases for the different vehicles. For local freight delivery, moving, and maintenance, we can use the metro system to deliver freight during off hours, as was suggested by at least one viewer. These would connect to electric-powered vans or trucks in the town center, which would in turn go out along the multi-use paths for their deliveries, probably favoring the early morning hours. And remember, these bike paths are 6 meters kilometers wide. That is 20 feet wide at the very minimum, or 2 automotive lanes wide. So the very few pedestrians and bicyclists out during those hours should have no trouble dodging the delivery vans, especially since the delivery vans and trucks are moving rather slow. For moving and maintenance work, it might be wise to limit the dates and times, but keep in mind that in a really good community like this, experience with other ecologically based communities has been that people don't really move that much. Village Homes in Davis, California, for example, wasn't very popular with realtors, to say the least, because people moved so seldom and places were listed so seldom from that development. There was some concern about managing the forest belts between towns, in particular hauling the logs out on trucks. Now, the problem with today's electric trucks is that the batteries do weigh a lot for the use cases that we're talking about for trucks when they're going hundreds of kilometers at highway speeds between charges. But within the city, both distances and speeds are 10 times less than highway conditions. So the battery packs can again be a tiny fraction of what they would be for a long-haul truck. And also bear in mind that even very powerful truck motors are surprisingly small and lightweight. You could easily hold one in your hands and lift it. So trucking shouldn't be a problem. You might increase the number of axles to spread the load a little bit on the multi-use paths so that you don't have to overbuild the paths. But basically, it's a very tractable problem. What about emergency vehicles? Well, for a village of 6,000, you would expect about 6 firefighters and maybe a similar number of emergency medical technicians. And also bear in mind that the low-rise environment in the villages doesn't require nearly as large equipment as high-rises. So the trucks don't need to be that big in the first place. For police, a typical staffing level that's a little bit less than the US but equal to Singapore would have about 12 full-time officers per village. And again, as long as the housing is really equitable, these villages are likely to be very low crime, so there may be less demand for these services. Patrols should probably be on e-bikes, and this would be the one rare exception. We might govern those to maybe as much as 40 kilometers per hour, and that would be a 25 miles an hour. I can tell you from personal experience that you cannot walk away from a crash at that speed. I actually tore the door off of a pickup truck on a bike going that speed and ended up in the hospital. But for police work, I think the argument could be made that their bikes should be regulated at a somewhat higher speed than is common within Eden City. Police cars and ambulances are eminently easy to electrify. There's so much volume that's given over to the engines, and the amount of battery space that's required is so small in this environment that it can be done relatively easily. I have a friend who electrified a tractor in 14 days while managing a farm and commuting 30 miles a day to a nearly full-time job. So the retrofits can be done in the short run, and appropriate vehicles can be purpose-built soon enough. One other note is that the sirens can be a lot quieter because they don't have to compete with all that car noise. Bicycles and very small, light electric vehicles are much quieter. Police response times would be about 30 seconds anywhere in the village from getting a call. That's much better than almost anywhere in the world today. EMS would be 51 seconds anywhere in the village. That's twice as fast as the US National Fire Protection Standard, including 1 minute of turnout time. What about getting people to a reasonably specialized hospital? This would be the town center hospitals. Those are 9 minutes away, maximum, which is comparable to what we experience in cities today. And for people who need extreme specialist care, the kind you would only get in the regional and city centers, we could transport people in ambulances as necessary. But I think it would also be reasonable to create a hospital metro car, which would mean integrating your hospitals with the town, regional, and city centers. So they have their own metro cars, so they can actually run their own metro service and just phase it in with the existing metro as needed. And of course, in extreme cases, as is the case anywhere today, airlift would be an option. But again, if you look at these transit times, you would be very hard-pressed to transport a patient faster than you could on a metro to the city center or regional centers. So to summarize, Edenicity has a fundamentally ecological purpose. The idea is to redesign cities so that we meet our needs in as abundant a way as possible, while also healing the environment and ending the mass extinction without even really having to think about it and battle for it every day. So it's not surprising that Edenicity's transit system borrows a little bit from a few of ecology's basic concepts. Our overall approach to transit is to minimize land use, which is consistent with compact resource loops. Our poll from last week revealed that people preferred mixed transit modes, consistent with the ecological principle of interactive diversity. It's just more pleasing to us to have more ways to meet a need. This is us getting in touch with our identity as beings that evolved in complex ecologies, and it's a good thing. The solar sheltered multi-use paths provided energy, water harvesting, microclimate moderation, and serving several transit modes at once. This is a perfect example of the stacking of functions that we saw with the mulberry tree. As we saw, the key to making that work is to limit motorized vehicle speeds within the pedestrian zone to 10 kilometers an hour, or at most 20 kilometers an hour for emergency vehicles, and to build those vehicles much lighter and more compact if possible. Now, if you haven't already, go ahead and get a copy of the reference design. I put a link in the description. And while you're looking at that, it might occur to you to ask, why is so much of Edenicity low-rise? Hint, it has to do with food security, and we'll get into that in the next episode. Take care, stay green, see you next time.